The United States, Canada, and Mexico will sit down to review the USMCA trade agreement details. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, a pact that shapes the economic future of North America. The agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, was designed to strengthen regional trade, manufacturing, and now, 5 years later, leaders are preparing to assess what's working and what must change. Experts outline 3 possible outcomes from next year's review.
In 2026, USMCA or CUSMA, a treaty that governs close to $1 trillion in North American trade, will face a built-in test that most people still don't understand. The CUSMA Sunset Review sets a deadline designed to force a decision about whether the entire trade framework continues, or whether it enters a permanent state of leverage and uncertainty. And right now, we are moving toward that moment faster than most headlines are admitting. Formal Canada-US talks are about to begin, and what's coming is not a routine checkup. Washington is signaling hardline demands, and the United States has publicly floated the possibility of letting the deal expire if it doesn't get what it wants. In other words, the rules that hold the continental economy together are being turned into a bargaining chip. This is the moment Canada's deepest economic vulnerability becomes visible in high definition. It's also a live demonstration of a core TradEconomics principle. A country can be rich in resources, modern in institutions, and still be structurally poor in sovereignty, because its prosperity is plugged into a system designed and controlled elsewhere. So today, we're going to break down the real weapon here, how it works, what Washington is asking for, why the performance matters as much as the policy, and why the Global South should be watching this like a warning flare. Because this isn't just about trade. It's about power. Let's start with the weapon itself. CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, was not designed to run endlessly in the background like a permanent constitution for North American commerce. Its architects included a clause that changed the psychological and political nature of the deal. A mandatory review after 6 years, with a forcing deadline in 2026. And here's the key, this review mechanism doesn't just create a meeting. It creates a clock, a cliff. A permanent threat that can be activated whenever one party wants leverage. In plain language, this is what the sunset structure does. It turns market access into a timed privilege. It makes continuity conditional. It makes stability something you have to keep earning under pressure. And even if the agreement doesn't collapse outright, the design can still produce something almost as damaging, perpetual crisis. If extension isn't agreed, the treaty can enter a cycle of repeated, high-stakes reviews, meaning the continent lives with a recurring, will it survive, moment hanging over investment, supply chains, and domestic policy. This is why the Sunset Clause matters more than any single tariff fight. Tariffs are a weapon you fire at one sector. The Sunset Clause is a weapon that can hold the entire framework hostage. And for Canada, this is not an abstract problem. Canada's economic identity, its industrial model, its export logic, its supply chain architecture, has been built around secure US market access. When the treaty itself becomes uncertain, the entire Canadian economy becomes negotiable. That's why this isn't just a review, it's a structural vulnerability being tested. Now, with that leverage in place, what is the United States signaling? Washington's demands are not vague. They're not whispered hints. They are increasingly specific, public, and aimed at the core of Canadian domestic policy, meaning this is no longer a conversation about tariffs and quotas. It's a conversation about internal governance. In recent public remarks and testimony, US trade officials have highlighted a familiar set of targets. First, Canada's protected dairy system, supply management, has long been a high-priority pressure point. The US wants greater access. Second, Canada's digital and cultural policy space, especially rules designed to support Canadian content and media, has been singled out as a barrier. In American framing, this is about fairness. In reality, it's about who controls cultural and digital revenue flows. Third, provincial level measures that restrict US alcohol or favor local producers. Washington is signaling it wants those rolled back. Fourth, subnational rules tied to electricity policy, procurement, and provincial decision-making more broadly, areas that, in most countries, are treated as domestic governance, not trade concessions. Now let's pause, because this is the TradEconomics lens in high definition. When a trade negotiation becomes a mechanism to rewrite a neighbor's internal systems, from farm policy to digital culture to provincial purchasing rules, the meaning of trade has changed. Trade becomes a tool of domestic policy extraction. And here's the additional pressure point. While these demands are being emphasized, there has been far less clarity on removing existing punitive measures already hitting Canadian sectors like metals and manufacturing. In other words, the pain is not being presented as something Washington is eager to lift. It's being kept available, like a reserve weapon, while the negotiation moves into Canada's domestic policy space. That is how leverage works in asymmetric relationships. You don't offer relief up front. You keep it in your pocket as a future concession, if the other side gives you what you want. So what we're looking at here is not a mutual update to a treaty. It's a contest over whose rules govern the continental economy. Now let's talk about something mainstream analysis almost always misses, the performance of power. Because in coercive negotiations, theater is not decoration. Theater is the method. We've seen public statements suggesting the US is open to letting CUSMA expire. That language is strategically designed to travel, fast, into boardrooms, investment committees, and risk models. And here's the revealing nuance that defines asymmetric coercion. Leaders can privately soften their tone while publicly amplifying the threat. The stronger party doesn't need to repeat the threat face to face every time. The weaker party is negotiating against the broadcast possibility. This is a key point, so let's make it simple. The weaker party doesn't just negotiate across the table. It negotiates against the shadow over the table. When the US publicly floats, "We might walk away," it injects uncertainty into the target's economy. It forces Canadian businesses, investors, and provincial governments to start acting defensively, before a single clause has been changed. That's the mechanism. It's not just about legal text. It's about fear as an economic instrument. And that fear has consequences. When uncertainty becomes credible, capital hesitates. Expansion plans pause. Relocation becomes rational. The cost of ensuring trade rises. Supply chains start pricing in disruption. And over time, the weaker party begins to make concessions simply to restore predictability. This is coercive economics, not cooperative negotiation. Now, how is Canada positioning itself? Canada's response reveals the rich, yet poor, paradox in painful detail. On the surface, Ottawa's strategy has multiple tracks. First, Canada draws defensive red lines, especially around politically sensitive systems like dairy supply management. That's domestic survival politics. Second, Canada tries to pivot the conversation toward areas where it believes it has leverage: energy supply, critical minerals, integrated manufacturing, and broader North American competitiveness. The pitch is essentially, "We are essential to your supply chain security, so treat this as a partnership." Third, Canada quietly prepares for the worst by encouraging businesses to diversify supply chains and reduce exposure, an implicit acknowledgement that the coming environment may be more hostile, more volatile, and less predictable than the era that came before. But here's the brutal arithmetic. Canada can talk about diversification, but its economy is structurally wired south. A large majority of Canadian exports flow into the US market. The auto sector is deeply integrated across the border. Agricultural and energy networks were built for North American integration, not global independence. So diversification is not a switch you flip. It's a multi-decade project: factories, ports, logistics corridors, new trade relationships, new standards, new financing pathways. And the sunset review clock does not run on decades. It runs on political cycles, negotiation timelines, and deadlines. That means Canada's leverage is mostly negative. Canada can threaten mutual pain. It can warn of disruption to US supply chains. It can point out that the US will also be hurt by instability. But in a hierarchy of pain, Washington has calculated it can absorb more disruption than Ottawa. This is not a partnership being reviewed. It is a dependency being audited. Now step back and ask, what is the real question here? The real question is not what technical tweaks will be made to CUSMA. The real question is, what is the future of power in North America? Because the sunset mechanism functions like a forcing device. It pressures the continent toward one of two futures. Future 1, managed, rules-based integration, where the treaty creates predictability and disputes are contained. Future 2, weaponized uncertainty, where the treaty becomes a recurring hostage situation, and the threat of termination becomes a permanent bargaining tool used to extract domestic policy concessions. And make no mistake, that second future is not theoretical. It's already being rehearsed. If the agreement can be placed into recurring high-stakes review cycles, then markets are forced to live with an annual cliffhanger. That means every year becomes an opportunity for coercion. Every year becomes a moment where one side can say, give us more, or we destabilize the entire framework. That's not a trade deal. That's a governance mechanism. And for Canada, the implications are severe. Canada is a resource-rich nation facing a dominant neighbor that can use a clause, a deadline, and a public threat to pressure its sovereignty across multiple domains: agriculture, culture, provincial law, procurement, energy rules, and more. This is why TradEconomics keeps repeating a principle many people resist. Resources are not sovereignty. Wealth is not power. Power is control over the system. Power is the ability to impose uncertainty on others while remaining insulated from it yourself. Now let's widen the lens to the global stage. Because this is not just a Canada story. This is a blueprint. If this is the posture Washington can take toward its closest ally, one with shared borders, integrated industries, deep military ties, and decades of special relationship, language, then what does that mean for resource-rich states in the global south? If Canada can be pressured through treaty engineering and public threats, what does Brazil have when its supply chains run through US-centric finance? What does Indonesia have when critical inputs depend on systems it doesn't control? What does Nigeria have when commodity revenues and payment rails can be squeezed externally? This is the lesson being taught without being announced. Interdependence is not automatically mutual. Interdependence can be engineered into asymmetry. And when Washington speaks about a rules-based international order, here is the unspoken rule that too many countries learn too late: we draft the rules. We interpret the rules. And when convenient, we rewrite the rules. Your oil becomes strategic when it fuels our industries. Your minerals become critical when they power our technology. Your stability is called a shared priority until your government makes a choice we dislike. Then the vocabulary changes. The investigations begin. The tariffs appear. The access to markets and financial systems becomes conditional. So, when you hear CUSMA review, don't hear paperwork. Hear power management. Now, there's a final layer here that reveals the deepest cynicism of the system, the domestic political loop. Let's say the US escalates pressure, tariffs, threats, uncertainty. What happens next? Costs rise. Businesses complain. Food and input prices face pressure. Political backlash grows. And then Washington's solution often looks the same: state relief. Subsidies. Bailouts. Support packages. Think about that mechanism. First, a government breaks a market or destabilizes it by design. Then it uses public money, taxpayer money, to compensate domestic winners and manage domestic losers. Meanwhile, the target nation suffers uncertainty and capital flight. This is not an error. This is a feature. It transforms independent actors into permanent political clients. It shifts economic outcomes away from open competition and towards state-managed advantage. And it deepens dependency on both sides, dependency of domestic producers on subsidies, and dependency of the target nation on the dominant market's continued permission. Create the crisis. Charge a fee for the solution. Lock in the dependency. Repeat. That's why these treaty moments matter. Because they don't just change trade flows. They reorder political economies. So what's the TradEconomics verdict? The CUSMA review is not simply a negotiation. It is a stress test of sovereignty under interdependence. It signals that the older paradigm of North American trade, unequal, imperfect, but still framed as mutual gain, is being replaced by a harsher model, the economics of empire. The United States is not behaving like a partner managing a shared system. It is behaving like a hegemon managing its periphery. Its instinct is not to cooperate, but to control. Not to negotiate between equals, but to dictate terms under threat. For Canada, the dilemma is becoming unavoidable. Resist and absorb a draining, asymmetric struggle, or concede and accept a shrinking policy space, becoming more tightly locked into a system it does not command. And for everyone watching, especially across the global south, the lesson is brutal but clear. In a world of concentrated power, wealth is not a shield. Treaties are not protection. The rule of law is often the language the powerful use to discipline the powerless. There are moves on the board, but they are costly, and they require long-term thinking. True sovereignty means building alternatives, diversified trade corridors, regional industrial strategies, financial channels that don't depend on a single gatekeeper, logistics networks that make coercion expensive, not easy. It means processing more at home, controlling more of the value chain, and coordinating with others who refuse to be treated as mere suppliers in someone else's system. Because the real danger is not one demand, or one tariff, or one negotiation headline. The real danger is a permanent architecture of uncertainty, where market access becomes conditional, and domestic policy becomes negotiable under threat. That is the fertilizer trap logic scaled up to the treaty level. This is the analysis you won't get from mainstream coverage. If understanding the real mechanics of power matters to you, you're part of the TradEconomics mission. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next, because as these talks unfold, the headlines will focus on the drama. We'll focus on the structure. And share this with one person who still believes trade deals are just economics. In the age of coercive interdependence, awareness isn't just insight. It's the first form of defense.